COVID-19 has obviously disrupted the supply chains in very profound ways, exposed just about every weak link that exists in supply chains and the risks that are inherent in supply chains, but most importantly, highlighted the need to accelerate the change and the reimagination that needs to happen and the redesign that needs to happen in supply chains.
Welcome to the Inside Forbes Councils podcast. Each episode shares transformative insights and advice from members of Forbes Councils, a group of invitation-only communities for successful executives and entrepreneurs. This is Inside Forbes Councils.
Hey everyone, this is Stephen Ganoza. Welcome to Inside Forbes Councils. Today we have my interview with Razat Gaurav. Razat is the CEO of LLamasoft and a member of the Forbes Technology Council. LLamasoft technology helps business leaders design the supply chain they need to achieve their profitability, service, and growth goals. Razat shared his perspectives on leveraging data and AI in supply chain management, which data sources are helpful when there is no historical data, and how businesses should analyze their supply chains moving forward in anticipation of future uncertain times. Let's just jump in. All right, so Razat, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Great, thanks for having me.
So to kick things off, let's just start off a little bit about you, a little bit about LLamasoft. Tell me about the business that you're in, what you guys do.
I'm the CEO at LLamasoft. I've been here on board a little over 2 years now. We're a supply chain analytics firm, and what that means is we take data from the enterprise. The enterprise could be retailers, manufacturers, distributors, logistics companies, and we take data from the market, like weather data, consumption data, macroeconomic data, and Google traffic data, for example. And we then help companies develop a digital representation of their physical supply chain. So what that means is all the way from sourcing into production, to distribution, logistics, transportation, fulfillment, extending into demand. For that extended supply chain, we help companies develop a digital model. And then we use a whole set of advanced algorithms, could be machine learning algorithms, could be simulation, could be optimization algorithms, to help them make decisions on roughly 30 different types of problems. And then we don't stop there. We then have a low-code, no-code platform that allows them to build apps, micro apps, very rapidly to help operationalize those decisions. So in a nutshell, we're an enterprise decisioning platform that's leveraging data and leveraging the state of the art in terms of AI technologies.
Tell me a little bit about who your clients are. Like who are you selling these services to?
Yeah. So we work with leading, we have about a little over 750 customers worldwide. So we work with leading retailers, companies like IKEA, Walmart, Starbucks. We also have customers in the manufacturing sector, just about every subsegment of manufacturing, companies like Unilever, General Motors, Caterpillar, companies like Dow DuPont. And then we have various logistics service providers as customers as well, companies like DHL, UPS, Penske. And any company that has a physical supply chain, a physical operation, more than likely we have a reference customer somewhere in the world. We're headquartered here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but we have offices all around the world, across Asia, Latin America, Europe. And we tend to work with mostly Fortune 5,000 companies. But we do have a lot of companies that are smaller, but have more complicated supply chain problems and are looking to use our modeling tools, our network design capabilities, our decisioning capabilities to make complicated decisions.
What you're giving to your client then is I think you called it a digital representation of their supply chain.
Yeah.
What does that look like in practice? Don't the companies have this already? Presumably they designed their operations. Why do they need you to help them map out how they work?
Yeah, they have designed their operations, but typically they are always having to reevaluate these designs, right? Companies, particularly at this time, are going through significant changes, significant disruptions. And those disruptions, whether they are being led because of trade and tariff policies or because of the COVID-19 crisis or various changing economic trade-offs require a reevaluation and a redesign. So that's the first part. The second aspect is, even though companies may have some semblance of a design, data actually across this end-to-end supply chain sits in hundreds, if not thousands, of different systems. There is no one single reference model that helps you understand what are the interrelationships between, let's say, a dock door in a warehouse impacting my product flows, or supplier locations or inventory availability impacting my ability to execute on a production plan, right? Or if you're a retailer, how does my store operating hour or my frequency of replenishment into the store need to impact the sort of transportation capacity I need to have? There's all these different interrelationships, and data, the way these companies have evolved, most companies have evolved, resides in hundreds of different systems. So part of what we do is, a lot of people talk about AI and algorithms, but without having the right data foundation, none of those advanced algorithms are really usable, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. So we don't take that for granted. We take that very seriously, and we really try to help our customers first develop that digital data foundation. And many companies are on this digital journey. Everyone is talking about digitalization. And part of that digitalization is not just to get new sources of data, that's one aspect of it, but to also bring context to that data so that they understand how these different data elements interrelate to each other to represent that living, breathing, current, and refreshed version of the supply chain. Another word for that is the digital twin of the supply chain, right? I can tell you right now, that doesn't happen overnight. That takes developing a digital twin of the supply chain requires a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and a lot of hard work, and integrating across a plethora of different systems. And then once you have that, then you can use all the advanced algorithms and the cool math to really think about how do you make smarter and faster decisions.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. You can have the platform and the technology to run the analytics and do the predictive modeling, but the first step is to make sure you have the data, whether that's new data or if you've got the data already, just putting it into a usable form or extracting it from wherever it is and whatever system it's in and feeding it in.
Yeah, and it's not so simple as just here is the database that includes all the data. It's also making sure you understand how one change in one element of the supply chain impacts all the downstream and upstream, impacts, right? So all the upstream and downstream processes, and that's not straightforward to model, right? But once you have that model, that baseline model there, and you can keep that refreshed and current with live feeds of data, then that's a very, very potent asset, because now you can play out all kinds of scenarios. You can do all kinds of what-ifing, a lot of war gaming, especially in times like this when there's so much uncertainty. Some of these decisions you're trying to make have, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars worth of impact on your balance sheet, your working capital, on your P&L. So thinking through and being able to simulate the data, thinking through and being able to play out different scenarios before you make a very capital-intensive decision is of huge value to companies.
You touched on, or you gave some examples of applications of using the platform, of using the data. I'm wondering if there's an example of the impact or the results that a client has had success.
Yeah, what's interesting is just collecting the data and creating a reference model of your supply chain, the digital twin of the supply chain, and just lighting that up through a descriptive visualization of that physical supply chain in itself sometimes unravels all kinds of insights for companies. What we've seen is by looking at that data and visualizing how you're performing on different KPIs, metrics, product flows, bottlenecks, capacities, that descriptive aspect, and looking at that holistically in itself is of huge value to companies, right? And that's where you start saying, hey, I may be having an issue. Why am I servicing this cluster of customers from this distribution center or this factory when there's a different one that's a lot closer, right? Very simple and obvious things, but it's hard for you to unravel that when you cannot see the forest from the trees, right? And then once you have that, then you can play out all kinds of different scenarios and analyze to make different types of decisions. So I'll give you some examples of that. We work with one of the large retailers, one of the world's largest furniture retailers, and they have over 2,000 suppliers that they are sourcing from, 2,000 companies and tens of thousands of different locations. And they carry, millions of SKUs across their store network, their online presence. And so it's a complicated supply chain, right? This is 40, 50 billion plus dollar business. And they wanted to have a better way of making their sourcing decisions to say, okay, should I source from supplier A, B, or C? And sometimes those suppliers could be in China, they could be, near shore, could be somewhere in Eastern Europe, or they could be more domestic, and the trade-offs of the costs are very complicated to calculate because it depends on the routings, it depends on the cost of good for manufacturing that product in that particular location, the lead times, because how long it takes to get something from China is very different from having something more domestically. The quality measures and the risk measures, which are becoming more and more important, especially after COVID-19. So we developed a total landed cost model in order for their category managers who are making these sourcing decisions to make those decisions using data, using a sort of a fact-based paradigm in making those sourcing decisions on an ongoing basis. And now we have over hundreds of users across their category management team and the supply chain organization using this application and getting tremendous value. And that's resulted in them being able to make decisions that not only minimize their cost in the short term, but as importantly, they maximize their availability of inventory in their stores and in their online channels, right? So it's impacted both the top line and the bottom line in that situation. That's an example of a sourcing use case. We've got other situations where some of our customers are making decisions, for example, for how do you place inventory, right? We work with a very large industrial manufacturing company that's making farming equipment, machinery, heavy machinery. Right. And they've got a network where they've got multiple factories all around the world, and they've got a multi-tier distribution network where they store inventory for these finished products. And then they go into market through a dealer network. So they've got dealers in all these various countries and regions. And they typically have to figure out, okay, how do I balance my demand with how much I need to produce? And then how do I allocate inventory and how do I place inventory in this distribution network across my own distribution network, which is multiple tiers of DCs or warehouses, as well as across my dealer network, right? So it's a complicated, what some people call a multi-echelon problem, right? And so we partnered with them. We took data from them and historical data, forward-looking demand data, looking at their location data for their distribution network, for their manufacturing network, for their dealer network. And we developed for them a multi-echelon inventory optimization capability. And now they're able to make intelligent decisions on a monthly basis. They've got a monthly cadence for the solution that they're using globally now that has resulted in significant reduction in their overall working capital in terms of how much inventory they need to carry in order to still have the same sort of service level that they expect and that they promise to their dealer networks and to their customers. So that's an inventory use case. We've got other examples. For example, right now in the COVID situation, a lot of companies are struggling because demand has been disrupted. depending on the industry, your demand is either spiked. So, for example, if you're manufacturing things like cleaning supplies, toilet paper, food items, especially certain categories of food items, you're at an all-time high in terms of demand. On the other hand, there's some other industries like in the case of automotive or high fashion, where demand has significantly slowed down. And so, and at the same time, supply has been disrupted as well. I mean, initially with COVID-19, there was a trend towards, everyone was concerned about what's happening in China. But then as the pandemic spread beyond China to countries like Korea, Japan, Italy, and then ultimately to the rest of Western Europe and then to North America, this really became a global phenomenon. And the disruptions that we were initially seeing in China for shutdown of factories started happening all over the world. And it didn't just impact factories, it also impacted, the movement and flow of goods, right? So for example, a lot of the air cargo capacity actually moves on passenger planes and the underbelly of passenger planes. And when all these flights got canceled, the air cargo capacity globally shrank by 40-50%. And so the same case was there for container shipping and over the road freight, etc. So companies were experiencing a lot of disruptions, and many of our customers, they have supply chains that have long lead times, especially like, for example, in fashion and apparel industry, right? And in that industry, you typically place your orders 4, 5, 6 months in advance of the new season. So we're getting into the summer season here in North America, and those orders were placed beginning of this year already, because these are longer lead times. A lot of these merchandise get manufactured in parts of China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, countries like that. So the problem was with COVID, the stores were shut because of the lockdown. So none of the inventory in the stores was moving, but the sales online was shooting through the roof, right? So there was a dichotomy in these supply chains where one part of the supply chains were experiencing record high demand, and on the other end of the supply chain, it came to a dead halt, right? Like it was just stagnant. So we used interesting, machine learning capabilities to gather the data, get smart about how to project demand, not just looking at your traditional techniques and traditional elements, but also to look at external elements. So what would be some leading indicators that would determine, how we are trending towards the return to normal behaviors, to normal demand patterns? We modeled those with our data scientists. We also helped some of our customers develop the right way to smooth the flow of inventory. So what do you do with your aging inventory versus getting the fresh merchandise? So there's many different use cases like that we enable, but all of that happens when you're able to invest the time and effort in getting that digital twin, that data foundation in place. And then we have a modeling workbench that allows you to model different scenarios and then visualize it and then make smart decisions that can have huge impact in driving customer service levels, operating costs, working capital, very, very strategic elements.
In regard to the pandemic, right? Pre-pandemic, companies presumably had their supply chains worked out, whether they're clients of yours or not, and then the pandemic happens. But if you're modeling based on historical data in part, how quickly can you pivot to account for some black swan event like a pandemic?
Yeah. Historical data is useful, but it's not sufficient, right, is what we found. And that was one of the big changes we had to bring about with our customers, is to not just look at historical data, but to look at, trend data that was external. Like, for example, Google or Amazon, if Amazon is a channel, or if Google is publishing a lot of data that, is based on keyword searches, or looking at traffic patterns with where there is traffic going, evaluating all these kinds of more current data sets, and then correlating those to how those elements impact your demand is what's very useful in addition to just your historical sales data, right? And that's part of the power of artificial intelligence, is in being able to harness all these different internal and external data sets and bring insights and go through learning cycles very quickly and provide predictions that are going to be far, far better than just using only historical data, using some traditional statistical techniques, right? So that's a very important learning that the entire industry has had. But also, I think in general, a lot of companies have designed their supply chains in an effort to minimize cost, minimize working capital, while still maintaining high service levels, right? And that's a remit that has come all the way from shareholders and boardrooms and CFOs and CEOs to supply chain organizations. And supply chain professionals have stepped up to that and driven a lot of productivity improvements. And that's been happening for many, many years. However, I think what COVID-19 and the crisis around COVID-19 has exposed is that only looking at cost and service are not sufficient. There is a third important criteria to weigh in, which is risk, right? And people have talked about risk for many years, and people have put in place business continuity plans because of floods in Thailand or earthquakes in Japan and hurricanes and things like that. But most of those were very concentrated in one or two locations, right? COVID-19 has been a global issue, right? And so I think what's going to be interesting is, and of course, the first part of the pandemic, everyone was just worried about how do you restore operations and how do you be in a reactive mode. I think now the discussion and the debate is shifting to how do we need to evolve our supply chain, and really in some situations, how do we need to reimagine our supply chain, whether it's in making sourcing decisions, how do you get more optionality when it comes to sourcing, when it comes to production locations, how do I get more optionality when it comes to production? We work with several high-tech consumer electronics manufacturers, and if you look at the production base for smartphones, 70% of the production capacity globally is concentrated in China, and that too in a very small subsegment of the region in China. And so many companies are evaluating now how can they evolve and not be so concentrated, not take away from all that capacity that's available in China, but also create new fronts for production capacity in countries like Vietnam or India or other countries like that. And so I think we'll see a bigger trend, and optionality and risk mitigation will be an important theme in how supply chains get designed. And also the other aspect is not just the location of sourcing suppliers and production, but also how much buffer inventory you're carrying in your supply chain. I mean, thank God buffer inventory exists in the supply chain. That's why we were able to still get through this pandemic without huge amounts of disruption, right? And in different industries and different product categories, you're carrying different levels of not the number of days of supply of inventory, right? And again, there, the dominant thought process driven by shareholders, driven by boardrooms has been, you got to minimize your inventory level, right? Because it has a material impact on the balance sheet. Till a situation like this happens, and if you don't have enough buffer inventory, you can't service the demand and you're caught on the wrong footing. So what is the right balance between cost, service, and risk is going to be a very important theme and a debate and a discussion that boardrooms will be having, as we get past the COVID-19 timeframe and as we get these operations reopened. And that's where our point of view is that using data-driven analysis, analytical capabilities with fact-based insights is going to be very key to taking out the emotion from those very big decisions in evaluating those cost, service, and risk trade-offs. But that's going to be a very important evolution and very interesting to watch, because that could impact global trade flows in a very, very significant way.
Adding a risk element to it would also, I assume, on the consumer end, increase the cost of goods, correct?
Well, it could, and that's where there's all kinds of scenarios, and that's why it's not a very straightforward, decision to make. It's complicated because it sounds like a good thing. Hey, I want to minimize risk, but okay, if my cost of goods is going to go up, then what do I do? Do I pass on that additional cost with margin added on top of that to the end customer? In many cases, consumers, which could have an inflationary impact on the economy? Or do I eat that cost increase and be willing to slightly dilute my margin in the short term while I look for other ways of driving productivity and efficiency improvements, right? I think there will not be a one size fits all answer to that. It'll really depend on the industry. It'll really depend on the companies, where they sit, where their balance sheets sit. And that's why I'm saying these are not going to be straightforward decisions to make. They're going to be complicated decisions. But that's where I think having the data, having the scenarios, having the ability to analyze these various options will be very critical.
So it sounds like we're still sort of in a band-aid phase. Supply chains have done what they can do immediately to deal with the current pandemic, but there's a lot more work to do to basically prepare for the next one.
There's definitely a lot more work to do. I mean, one of the things I like to tell people is global supply chains have existed for over 5,000 years. This is not something new, right? It's not like we've only become global as humanity in the last 30, 40, 50, 100 years. Global supply chains existed 5,000 years ago when people were trading across continents. And in that time frame, there have been different ebbs and flows and different directional changes. And a lot of that has been driven by population movements, consumerization, the development of economies, industrialization efforts. So I think those evolutions will continue to go forward. That doesn't mean that global supply chains will evaporate. Not everything can be done domestically in every country. That's just not practically feasible for most supply chains. But to what extent they change, they are not very simple decisions to make. Because, I'll give you an example of that. If you're a semiconductor company making semiconductor chips that go into high-tech electronics goods, it may be very simple for you to say, okay, I want to, instead of manufacturing everything in Taiwan and China, I want to open up new plants in Mexico or India or somewhere else. But that's, to open up a new semiconductor plant could take over $1 billion or $2 billion of capital investment. Where's that money going to come from? That's a big decision to make. And then even when you make that decision, then there's a lead time to make the transitions happen. So I don't see, everything, all supply chain issues getting fixed, in a sort of a V-shaped recovery. This is going to be a gradual evolution. I think supply chain professionals and supply chain organizations in general have done a good job of being very responsive and reactive to these unforeseen situations that COVID-19 presented. But I think the evolution will be a more gradual and a more deliberate evolution. It's not just going to happen overnight. I think it's going to take several years for us to really understand the impact of COVID-19 in its entirety.
So let's sum this up with some advice to businesses and to other business owners. Given that it's going to take time, given that there's a lot of stuff going on right now, what advice would you have for business owners today in evaluating, where they are, where their supply chain is? Maybe not in regard to COVID, but to whatever the next crisis is, whether it's a pandemic or some, big geopolitical risk, right? Whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think the first thing is the C-suite needs to be involved in and engaged in understanding the risks that are inherent across your current state of your supply chain, right? And so mapping out that supply chain, because in many supply chains, you don't just have a single tier of suppliers, you have tier 2 suppliers, tier 3 suppliers, and mapping out that end-to-end value chain that you exist in is the first starting step, right? And exposing that and exposing the risk elements that are clearly in place today and have been exposed even further, I think needs to be something that the broader executive suite needs to understand. The third thing I would recommend is to really start leveraging data to analyze what are some risk mitigation efforts that you can take, right? What are some scenarios you can play out without going out in the field, because that's going to be too expensive and too long. Once you have that digital foundation, play out those scenarios and do the what ifing and bring to the table, a data-driven, fact-driven kind of an analysis to look at what are the set of mitigation steps you can take. And then the last thing I'll say is be open to change. If anything, the need for change is being further accelerated. As I talk to some of the leading companies around the world, manufacturers or retailers, the consistent thing I hear is that all the things that they thought they had to do because of various changes in the markets that they operate or the operating model that they had or the consumers that they were shifting with, all those changes had to be made only faster now thanks to COVID-19. So be willing to change, but take a non-emotional, data-driven approach to it and leverage the scientific capabilities that are available so you're able to make those big bet decisions with informed decisions. And then the last thing I'll say is, even when you do that, be ready to evolve and change, because we've just gone through COVID-19. What's going to happen next year or the year after or 5 years from now? It's hard to predict. So incorporating the ability to adapt and be agile and be responsive is going to be a key element in how you design your supply chain. And so that willingness and that adaptability is really key as we go forward in supply chains.
Razat, how can people find out more about you or your business?
Yeah, you can visit us on our website at LLamasoft.com. That's LLamasoft.com. We've got a ton of information. We've got case studies. We've got solution overviews. We've also got local contacts ourselves or our partners all around the world. So yeah, welcome you to look us up. Or also you can look us up on LinkedIn and on various social media channels as well.
Razat, all great advice. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it, to talk about supply chains, data, using the data, and then being prepared to pivot on a moment's notice to something else.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like more content on supply chain management,
if you're the supply chain executive, you have to be driving cost improvement, cash improvement, service, quality, but you also have to own the revenue and the top line for the company.
The transformation of the supply chain that's occurring electronically in various aspects, in various ways, seems to be both helping people be more close to the customer. It also seems to be creating some confusion out there, or shall I say, accelerating some of the bad habits of the past.
If you haven't already, check out episode 44, where Forbes Business Council member and CEO of MainPoint, Steve Bowen, speaks with Michael Burnett from the University of Tennessee's Global Supply Chain Institute about the impact of digital transformation and company culture on sales and operations planning. Well, that's all we have for today. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.
This has been Inside Forbes Councils. Please be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a member of the Forbes Councils and would like to participate in our podcast series, please email your member concierge. If you're interested in joining a Forbes Council, learn more at ForbesCouncils.com.